I'm curious. I am curious. Curious.
By nature.
Welcome to Curious by Nature. I'm Jessica Johnson from Newswise. Stress is in all of our lives. It seems to be everywhere. People talk about it all the time. It's really bad for our health. We're constantly hearing how stress is causing problems in this way and that way and the other way. We feel it. But when someone tells you to reduce your stress and you have to reduce stress, sometimes it's very difficult to understand how you can actually do that. Our guest today provides real, tangible tips to be able to deal with stress. Dr. Neupert, welcome. Please introduce yourself.
My name is Shevaun Neupert. I'm a distinguished professor of psychology at North Carolina State University. I'm curious about everything related to stress.
I was drawn to a recent publication in the journal Mental Health Science about stress and how it makes younger people look and feel older. Can you tell me more about the study?
I'm really interested in how the stress process unfolds in daily life. And so the way I try to investigate that is through a daily diary design where I ask participants to report on their stressful experiences and other health and well-being indicators that are interesting to me for a series of consecutive days. So in this particular study, for 8 consecutive days, we had over 100 young adults answer questions about the stressful encounters that they experienced. So it could be something like an argument or a disagreement or something stressful in their work environment. Some of them were in school, so their school environment as well. Anything stressful at home. So they were able to tell us if they had experienced stressors in these various domains. And we counted the number of yes responses to those stressors. So each day for each person had a stress index, so the number of stressors they'd experienced. And then we also asked them on each of these days to report how much control they felt they had over their lives. So we asked them to report on things like how much they felt like there could be barriers that were getting in the way of them achieving their goals. So that would be an indication of pretty low feelings of control. And then we would ask them questions about whether they felt like they had the opportunities or the skills to meet the goals that they had set for themselves. So that would be an indication of a relatively high feeling of control. And then finally, in this particular study, we asked them to report just fairly simply, how old do you feel today? And then we also asked them to report, how old do you look today? And so their answers to those last 2 questions were simply numeric, the age that they felt and the age that they believed they looked. And so what we did was we put all that data together and we were able to see that for these younger adults, on days when they experienced an increase in stressor, so they had more stressful things happen compared to fewer stressful things happen, they felt a lot older and they also looked a lot older. And this is especially true on days where they felt like they didn't really have a lot of control on their lives. So this aging effect of stressors was qualified or really depended on how much control the people felt like they had on that given day.
So even if they were stressed, but they had control, they didn't feel necessarily as old.
That's right. They didn't experience any significant change in how old they felt or in how old they looked. It was really interesting. If they were able to believe, because it's a perception, right? So if they were able to believe or to perceive that they had a high amount of control over their life, then there was not this aging effect of the stressors for them. It really only was for the days where people felt like they had very little control.
And would you say that those perceptions of control are something that is completely a perception, or is it also a reality objectively?
I think it's tricky to know for sure, because there's likely many scenarios where we could have objective amounts of control, but there could be varying perceptions in how that is understood. So I think of my postdoc advisor, Margie Lockman, who is such a world-renowned expert in control belief. She talks about this idea that, you could perceive that you have a lot of control over your financial life, like your financial state, like, yes, I'm fully in control. But then you have $3 in your checking account. And so there's this disconnect between what the objective reality might be or how that might be influencing the perception. So it's often exceptionally hard to know what is the truth. Is the truth really objective? And I think what Margie and others would say is that the perception is what drives our behavior. So it actually really does matter what people perceive, even if we don't know what the objective reality might be, because our perceptions are what's driving the behavior.
And so is that what you're looking at maybe in helping people to change those perceptions of control?
That is a tricky business to even consider. It's hard to move people's perceptions of control. It really is. I mean, this is a challenge to try to intentionally set out to change people's perceptions is challenging. And so I think the ways in which my work and work of Margie Lockman and others has been modestly successful in the past is in very particular domains. So we have a paper where we were able to increase people's perceptions of control over their exercise beliefs. So we were able to boost their feelings of like, yes, I can do this. I can do this very particular strength training exercise for adults who were previously sedentary. They were taught how to do strength training with resistance bands. It's something they could still do while they were seated. They could increase their strength. And we were able to show that we could increase their self-efficacy or their perceptions of control over the exercise. And when we were able to increase those perceptions, we were also able to increase their performance on cognitive tests. So it actually had some important consequences for their memory functioning. And so my work tries to understand stress from the beginning until the end of the process. And I consider the beginning to be before the stressor even happens. So I do a lot of work trying to understand how people might plan or prepare or anticipate stress in the future. And so I ask participants to think about their tomorrows. How likely is it that you might have an argument tomorrow? How likely is it that you might have something stressful at work tomorrow? And so they report on their tomorrows for a series of consecutive days. And then when tomorrow arrives, I ask them, well, did you have an argument today? How were your emotions today? How was your physical health today? How much control do you feel you had today? So I ask them to report on these things as they're experiencing them. And as part of that, I also ask people to think about or report on the kinds of coping that they might be doing even before the stressor happens. So they can do some anticipatory coping to try to lessen the effects of the stressor. So some of these might look like plan rehearsal as one of the domains. They try to come up with a plan, like rehearse something in a step-by-step fashion. Oh, if I'm going to have an argument with this person, maybe I should, take a breath and pause before I respond. What might be some, steps that they could think through mentally to rehearse before they would encounter that situation. That is typically connected with a decrease of the stress response. So there would be less of a chance of having a decrease in control beliefs if that coping was applied before. We can also think about another kind of coping that is sometimes interesting, and the name of it is stagnant deliberation. Which sounds kind of negative, like stagnant doesn't really sound great, but I think it helps to describe what is happening in this particular form of anticipatory coping. Someone's really trying to understand, like, what could I do? How could I solve this problem? How could I, try to navigate the stressor? But they get stuck. They mentally get stuck. They're not able to come up with a plan. So just kind of stagnating on it, like almost, having thoughts spin around in their head about it. And so when our participants are reporting that they're doing that the day before a stressor, when they do encounter the stressor, that's not always bad. They've invested some time in thinking through, like, well, this thing might happen, and they come up with all these different possibilities. And so maybe, even though yesterday they didn't think any of those ideas were any good, it actually turned out that one of them was useful when the stressor did come up in the tomorrow.
But what about for relating it to the stress of your study, I think, was teens, 20s, and 30s?
Yeah, 18 to 36 was the range of this particular study. And so, we didn't necessarily try to intervene in any way. That's probably something that's really important to highlight. We asked participants to just tell us about their naturally occurring perceptions of control. And I think if there is one potential positive message to take from these particular participants is that even if they did experience a low level of control beliefs, it didn't stay there. These were dynamic fluctuations in control beliefs that changed across the 8 days of the study. So it's not that we're necessarily comparing people who have low levels of control. We're comparing days within people where they experience low levels of control, and then maybe the next day they experience a high level of control. So I think a good future direction might be, well, what could be some factors that might help promote increases in control beliefs? And we know from past work that, decreasing exposure to stress might be one of those possibilities. But in this study, we weren't necessarily trying to intervene in how they experience control. We were just trying to understand that they experienced these fluctuations.
What are the primary sources of stresses in our lives today?
I think what we know from big national studies of adults across the US is that the most common stressor experienced on a daily basis would be things that are interpersonal in nature, so arguments or disagreements. And so those tend to be some of the most powerful influences in our health and well-being if we're looking at the effects of stressors. So when we have those arguments or disagreements, or there's also an interesting item developed by Dave Almeida, he's my PhD advisor, about the fact that even when you avoid a stressor, that can still be stressful. So the question would be phrased like, is there something you could have argued about, but you decided to let it pass? So it's acknowledging there was this potential for a disagreement or argument. Even though you didn't engage in it, you could still experience the consequences of that disengagement. And so those are the kinds of stressors that are the ones that tend to be the most powerful for our daily health and well-being.
So financial, not really as strong as interpersonal.
Well, financial stressors, if they manifest on a daily basis, and certainly if there's an interpersonal component, absolutely, right? So if the arguments that people are having are financial in nature, then certainly you could imagine a double whammy, right? Is that this could be a consistent or more chronic source of these more daily manifestations of arguments. So yes, I don't want to discount, the content of the stressor, of what might be the source of the argument or what might be the source of the work stressor. Certainly it could be not enough hours at work, being underpaid, being underemployed. Those things can be stressful as well. We tend to think about them and how they might be captured with who else is involved or what domain of life is involved. And finances probably can touch on nearly any particular stressor environment.
Because it's so interesting, it's everywhere people and experts are saying reduce your stress. So often it's like, how does that really happen? How can people really reduce their stress? It's such a kind of an easy recommendation, but the details of doing that can be so complicated. So it's so nice to hear about these very specific, it's not necessarily eliminating the stresses, it is having the tools to address them. So.
Right. And if they can be addressed in the earlier stages before they can build and become something that's really, really potent, then that tends to be a better outcome that takes less effort to address something in its earlier stages.
Mm-hmm. What do you think about, I guess the sources also supposedly social media is adding to a lot of teenagers or maybe young adults' stress. Would that be under the interpersonal?
I think that's a good question. It wouldn't necessarily need to be. It could be its own category of exposure to information. I've done some work related to election-related stress and how people try to cope with elections in the campaign phases as we're leading up to the day of the election, and then how they cope with the election once it's over. And I think there is something particular about those kinds of rhythms. I think social media might be another kind of good example here because it's a source of information. It's to some extent a source of engagement, but it's not fully interpersonal in the way that we would imagine a face-to-face conversation. So it probably is something that would deserve its own classification. And I think the extent to which people can choose for themselves their level of engagement that is good for them. This could be one way of doing some coping ahead of time. If you're aware that this is a particularly stressful week in your life or day, then being able to make decisions about what you will engage in terms of information, if it's coming from social media, TV, news, wherever information comes in, I think it's good when people can intentionally select what they would like to have in their environments.
Are people getting stressed with things that wouldn't have stressed a 60 or 70-year-old person or, someone maybe 50 years ago? Is there an issue of people getting easily stressed?
Adults in 1995, when the National Study of Daily Experiences started, they were a sample of people across the U.S. aged 25 to 74, and they were asked these same questions about the stressors in their life for 8 consecutive evenings over the phone. And so they reported on the stressful experiences. Researchers went back to those same people 10 years later, asked them the same questions, and saw that those same people, just by living 10 more years and experiencing all the socio-historical changes that have happened in those 10 years, experienced on average an entire week more of stressors than they had 10 years prior. So there's an increase, especially for people in midlife. This trend was especially pronounced for people in midlife in the sample. That the takeaway from this particular study is that midlife is getting more stressful, that people are experiencing more stress in midlife. There's something about this time period of life now where people are reporting more stressors. Whether they're getting more easily stressed, I don't think we have the answer to that question, but they are reporting that they're experiencing more, and that's a change from their own experiences 10 years before.
Because it seems like maybe life has changed so much in terms of the amount of information we get, the ability or the need or the necessity for us to be on constantly, to have, maybe we take work with us everywhere. But at the same time, there are many things that are much easier. But it doesn't necessarily mean that our nervous systems aren't taxed by all of this constant information.
It's true that our bodies don't necessarily know the difference between when we are having a stressful experience that is challenging, something like, ooh, this is a great opportunity. I, might get a little nervous. I'm going to go do this. It's like our bodies can have the same physiological response to things that might be pleasurable, but the body still feels as stressful, or to truly negative, stressful experiences.
Other than the tools that you've mentioned in terms of being able to address stressors that might be in people's lives, what about how to eliminate stress from one's life? What would you recommend?
Eliminate is a strong word, right? It's pretty tricky to be a social being in the world and truly eliminate stress. But I appreciate the question. I think it's really good to think about, like, if that's extreme, what would be some extreme things, or what could be some things that people could do? So 2 things come to mind. There's been a lot of work on mindfulness-based stress reduction. So learning tools of mindfulness, even, taking the time to take 3 deep breaths has a way of creating physiological changes that can disrupt the stress response physiologically. So if people are interested in learning some mindfulness techniques, that can be a way to try to disrupt the physiological impacts of stress, or possibly prevent stress from happening. But what I do in my work tends to focus more on the coping side, how to cope before a stressor happens. So proactive coping would be a set of skills or tools that a person can use to try to decrease their stress exposure. So avoiding people who you know are likely going to bring stress into your life, if possible, right? Planning ahead so that you are not taken aback or in a stressful scenario where things go wrong and, now you're late to whatever you need to go to. So it's a doing annual doctor visits. Like these are things that tend to be very preventative, tend to be very planful, things that are done ahead of time to try to avoid stressors in the first place. So there are a set of tools that would fall in that proactive coping category.
For general health, for aging, for cognitive aging, it's important to get a good night's sleep. It's important your stress levels. It's important to eat healthy. It's important to exercise. The environment to be healthy around us, right? Do you think stress is the most important of those? If you had to choose one?
Yeah, I think stress is important. But actually, when I review the literature and what we know so far, if we're thinking about memory functioning, cognitive aging, trying to preserve and maintain functioning, exercise is actually the biggest one that seems to come up over and over and over again. And I'm launching a project within the next week or so with a team of engineers at NC State's campus. And we're going to have participants come to the lab and we're going to fit them with wearable sensors so we can understand how their bodies respond as they're doing various tasks. And we'll assess their cognition and we will have them do some exercise and we will monitor their gait, how they walk. We'll monitor their cardiovascular functioning. We'll monitor their physiological stress responses. And our hope is to be able to build some sort of digital signature that can help us understand ways in which we might be able to have some chances at early detection and then early intervention. And so that's where I think the two areas may come together, is that if we can see how stress responses and the benefits of exercise may work together in some sort of digital signature. I feel like there could be some possibilities there, but I acknowledge as much as, I get super excited about stress and talking all about it, there are other factors at play. And I don't want to discount the importance of being able to do positive things like exercise.
Thank you so much, Dr. Neupert. It was such a wonderful discussion.
Curious by Nature is a production of Newswise. More than 7,000 journalists get the Newswise wires. Visit newswise.com and find out how to spread your news today.